I should like, at the request of the delegation of the United Arab Emirates and on behalf of the members of the Security Council, to ask all those present now to stand and join in observing a minute of silence for Israeli civilians and foreign nationals who lost their lives on 7 October in Israel, and all Palestinian civilians who lost their lives in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, as well as the UN staff members and the journalists who lost their lives in the Gaza
ainsi qu'au personnel des Nations Unies, aux travailleurs humanitaires et journalistes qui ont également perdu la vie dans la bande de Gaza.
I would request all of us to stand up in observing a minute of silence.
Pónganse todos en pie para guardar un minuto de silencio.
Please be seated.
Merci de bien vouloir reprendre vos places.
The provisional agenda for the meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided.
Il en est ainsi décidé.
I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in this meeting in accordance with the provisional rules of procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided.
Pas d'objection, il en est ainsi décidé.
En este sentido.
In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting.
J'invite les intervenants suivants à participer à la présente séance.
Ghebreyes, Director General of the World Health Organization, and Mr. Mawa Gilani, Director General of the Palestine Red Crescent Society. It is so decided.
De la Media Luna Roja de Palestina. Así queda acordado.
The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 on the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Tedros Ghebreyes to present the briefing.
Je donne la parole à Monsieur Tedros Ghebreyes, directeur général de l'OMS.
Tiene usted la palabra.
谭德塞先生，你现在可以开始了。
The floor is yours, sir.
Vous avez la parole, monsieur.
Está usted en uso
Thank
de la
you.
palabra.
谢谢。
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. President,
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Excellencies.
各位阁下，
Thank you for this
感谢
opportunity
大家给我
Pour
这个
m'avoir
机
donné
会，
la
，to
possibilité
brief you on the
向
health
理事会做
situation
sur la
in
解释一
Gaza.
下加沙的
actuelle
最新
en
的情况。
Gaza, à Gaza.
Let me be
Impera en
clear
Gaza.
我想清楚地
from
表
the
明，
outset
Je vais
that
that I
être
fully
clair.
De
understand
entrada ya
the
quisiera dejar
anger
claro que entiendo
comprends parfaitement
perfectamente
la colère,
and fear of the Israeli
le deuil
people
和以色列
et
人
la
following
peur,
the
la
horrified
ira,
看到
barbarism
el pesar
and
y el
unjustified
temor del
attacks
pueblo
by Hamas
israelí tras
不断
los
的
and
他们
other
的哈
armed
马斯
groups
的
perpétrés par
on
le
Israeli
Hamas,
civilians
groupes
on the
armés
perpetrados
7th
por
contre
Hamas
les
y
civils
otros
du
grupos
6
armados
israélien
contra
le 7
The
octobre
Israel el
killing
7 de
of
octubre.
1,400
La
people
matanza
Tuer
de
1400
and injured
personas
to more than 7,200 others
et en
Hay
blessé
los
plus
más
de
de
700
700 heridos son algo
for the
incomprensible
quelque
survivors
chose
and
d'incompréhensible
families
对
pour
那些
les
人
rescapés, les
受害
familles
的家人
victimes
来
The
说，
et
mental
para
health
les
familiares de las
consequences will
víctimas
be
las
conséquences en termes de santé
for a
consecuencias
mentale
long time to come.
para su salud
feront
mental
ressentir
WHO is gravely
Pendant
concerned for the
longtemps
health and
duraderas.
well-being
La
of
OMS
Israeli
está muy
hostages in
preocupada
Gaza.
por esa, el
également
bienestar y la
Many
salud de
of
los
them
rehenes
des
israelíes que se
otages
encuentran
israéliens
retenidos en
détenus
Gaza.
en Gaza.
Muchos de ellos
with urgent
son
Personnes
ancianos,
âgées,
niños
des
y
enfants
personas
et des
con
personnes
necesidades médicas
nécessitant une aide
urgentes.
médicale
2 weeks
d'urgence.
ago,
Hace
Il y a 2
2
semaines,
semanas
families
je
of
me suis
hostages,
entretenue
hablé
avec
con
des
familiares de
familles
los
and I will
rehenes
meet them in Geneva next
que je
week.
rencontrerai
y
également
volveré a
à
reunirnos
Genève la
en
semaine
Ginebra
dernière,
Their
la semaine
semana
prochaine.
heartache and fear.
Siento
peur
su dolor y
Et
miedo.
leurs
I
douleurs
also
sont
understand
les miennes.
También
the
entiendo
anger,
Je comprends
grief,
également
la ira,
and fear of the people of
la
Gaza.
colère
el pesar
Who
y
had
el
already
temor de la
suffered
población de
Gazaouis.
Gaza,
years of blockade
que ya lleva
and are
sufriendo
now enduring the
16 años de
destruction of their
bloqueo y que ahora está
families,
sufriendo
their
assistent
homes,
aujourd'hui à la
destrucción de sus
destruction de leurs
familias,
familles, de leurs
de sus
foyers, de leur
hogares,
communauté,
the
de sus
life they knew.
comunidades y la vida que
la
conocíamos.
vie.
The situation on the ground is
Sur le terrain,
impossible
La
La situation
situación en el
est
terreno es
indescriptible.
imposible de describir.
hospital corridors crammed with the
Los pasillos de
injured,
los hospitales
the sick,
están abarrotados
the dying,
de
où s'entassent
enfermos,
des malades, des
Morts,
blessés, des personnes
overflows,
heridos,
migrantes,
moribundos,
surgery
depósitos de
without anesthesia,
des interventions chirurgicales
tens
sans
of thousands
anesthésie,
of displaced people
des
sheltered
dizaines de
at
milliers de
hospitals,
personnes déplacées s'abritant dans des hôpitaux,
families crammed into overcrowded schools,
las
desperate
familias
for
dans
se
des
food and
refugian
water.
confinadas en escuelas.
More than 10,800
Están
people have
desesperadas
now
por
been
refugiarse
Ils
killed in
attendent
Gaza.
désespérément de
Almost
nourriture.
más de
70%
10.000
of
personas
them
en Gaza.
women
De
Plus de
and
10 000
ellos,
personnes
casi
déjà tuées, dont 70%
800
sont
On
des femmes et
average,
des
son
enfants.
mujeres,
En
niños y
moyenne,
a
niñas.
child is
En
killed
promedio,
every 10 minutes in
toutes les
Gaza.
10
se
minutes,
mata
un
a
enfant
un
est
niño
tué à
o una
Gaza.
niña cada 10 minutos en
1.5
Gaza.
million people have been
1,5 million de
displaced
personnes ont
1,5
déjà
personas
été
and are
estado
looking for
desplazadas.
shelter anywhere
Están
they
tratando
can
de
find
cherchent à
it.
refugiarse
s'abriter partout
allí
où
donde
c'est
puedan,
possible.
Nowhere
Mais
pero en ningún
and
lugar
no one is safe.
personne
están a
n'est à
salvo
l'abri.
y nadie
Nowhere
está a
Aucun
salvo.
lieu
and
n'est
no
sûr.
one
Repito,
is safe.
Aucun
en
lieu n'est
ningún
sûr.
lugar están a
De
salvo,
As
personne
more
nadie
and more
está a salvo.
people move to a
Cada
smaller
vez más
and
De
personas
plus en plus de
se
personnes se
desplazan
déplacent
a un
vers
espacio
overcrowding
des
is
zones
más y
increasing the
más
risk
pequeño,
of
con lo cual
outbreaks
el
of diarrhea
hacinamiento
and respiratory
aumenta el riesgo de que
risques
sufran
de
enfermedades
de maladies
por contagio
infectieuses,
aéreo
Of course, WHO is on the ground
y
dermatologie,
in Gaza.
enfermedades
respiratoires et autres risques.
Alongside our partners,
infecciosas,
to support
dermatológicas.
Aussi de nos
La OMS
partenaires,
está en Gaza
nous nous efforçons
apoyando a nuestros
physically and
asociados,
mentally
trabajadores
exhausted
sanitarios que
and
están
are
física y
doing their
mentalmente
best
agotados y que están
qui
haciendo
sont
todo lo
épuisés
que
mentalement et
pueden
physiquement, mais qui
en
continuent de faire de
circunstancias
leur mieux
inimaginables.
dans des conditions
In addition to
inimaginables.
caring for the
Además
27,000
de
people
Outre les
cuidar
27
coming
000
out with
personnes
de las
blessées,
de
qui
las
many of
reçoivent
them
personas
des soins,
que han
with
resultado
life-threatening
heridas,
injuries,
muchas de ellas
nombreux
they're trying to manage the
heridas
regular health needs
que
of
amenazan su
2,000
vida, están
civilians.
tratando de atender las necesidades
s'efforcent de
More
répondre aux
than
médicas,
besoins
humanitarias de más de
180
2 millones de
women
personas.
give
Más de
birth in Gaza
180
every
mujeres
single day.
tous les jours, plus de 180
There
femmes.
are
alumbran un bebé
9,000
en Gaza
patients
cada día.
on
Hay ahora
cancer therapy.
900
And there are
pacientes de cuidado
more than
oncológico
50,000
y hay
patients with
350.000 pacientes de diabetes,
hypertension.
enfermedades
Autre de
cardiovasculares y
diabète,
hipertensión.
hypertension, d'autres
I visited
maladies de ce type.
Al-Shifa Hospital in
Visité el
Gaza
hospital de
à
5
l'hôpital
Al-Shifa
Al-Shifa à
en
Gaza.
hace 5 años, en
I
2018,
visited
il y a
dialysis
5
ward
ans.
and the neonatal intensive care unit.
Je me suis
visité
rendue dans les unités
la unidad
de soins
de
intensifs,
cuidado neonatal, cuidado
Even then,
intensivo,
in 2018 in Gaza,
y
conditions
hablé con
were
los
extremely
pacientes.
Je peux vous
Ya
dire
para
que
que
même en
empezando
2018, les
2018
conditions
las
étaient extrêmement
Now there
circunstancias eran
was
sumamente
difficiles
difíciles para los
pour
trabajadores
le personnel.
sanitarios, pero
And
es que
their
ahora
Le travail
su
est
trabajo es
doublement
in the
imposible
firing line.
Il
y se
se
encuentran
trouve en ligne
directamente en la línea de
de
fuego.
mire,
Since the
littéralement.
7th of October,
Depuis
Desde
le
el 7
7
de
WHO
octubre,
has verified
la
l'OMS
more than
a verificado
250 attacks
más de
plus de
250
150 attaques contre les établissements de santé à Gaza et en Cisjordanie.
en Gaza, en la Ribera Occidental, además
Ce qui
de
vient s'ajouter à
25.
20.
in Gaza, conditions were extremely difficult for health workers. Now their work is impossible, and they're directly in the firing line. Since the 7th of October, WHO has verified more than 250 attacks on healthcare in Gaza and the West Bank, in addition to 25 attacks on healthcare in Israel, hospitals, clinics, patients, ambulances. Last week, WHO documented 5 attacks on 5 hospitals in one day. In the past 48 hours alone, 4 hospitals have been put out of action, representing some 430 beds. More than 100 of our UN colleagues have been killed and counting. And as we speak, there are reports of firing outside the Al-Shifa and Rantisi hospitals. Half of the Gaza Strip's 36 hospitals and 2/3 of its primary healthcare centers are not functioning at all. Those that are functioning are operating way beyond their capacities. The health system is on its knees, and yet somehow it's continuing to deliver some life-saving care. The best way to support those health workers and the people they serve is by giving them the tools they need to deliver that care: medicines, medical equipment, and fuel for hospital generators. Field hospitals and emergency medical teams can complement and support existing hospitals and health workers in Gaza, but they cannot replace them. Supporting Gaza's health workers is at the heart of WHO's operational response plan. WHO was part of the first convoy of aid to enter Gaza through the Rafah crossing on the 21st of October. And since then, we have delivered 63 metric tons of specialist medical equipment and supplies that health workers need to save lives, including to hospitals north of Wadi Gaza. But this doesn't even begin to address the scale of need. It's too small. Before the 7th of October, an average of 500 trucks a day were crossing into Gaza with essential supplies. Since the 21st of October, instead of the expected 10,000 trucks, just 650 have entered. A month ago, just 2 days after the violence started, I met with His Excellency President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt, who agreed to support WHO and our partners to deliver aid through the Rafah crossing. I thank Egypt for its support in getting aid into Gaza and for establishing a medevac pathway to get the most critically sick and wounded patients out, including 12 children with cancer who are being transferred for treatment in Egypt and Jordan. WHO continues to call for unfettered access to deliver humanitarian aid to the civilians of Gaza, who are not responsible for this violence, but are suffering in ways that we in this room cannot imagine. We continue to call on Hamas to release the hostage it took, many of whom need urgent medical attention. We continue to call on Israel to restore supplies of electricity, water, and especially fuel. We continue to call on both sides to abide by their obligations under international humanitarian law. And we continue to call for a ceasefire to prevent further deaths of civilians and further damage to Gaza's hospitals and health facilities. Mr. President, Excellencies, I understand what the children of Gaza must be going through, because as a child, I went through the same thing, the same. The sound of gunfire and shells whistling through the air, the smell of smoke after they struck, tracer bullets in the night sky, the fear, the pain, the loss. These things have stayed with me throughout my life. I know the smell, the image of war. I know what war means. when my mother heard gunfire at night, she would make us sleep under the bed with more mattresses on top of one bed, in the hope we might be protected if a shell fell on our house, a mother's instinct to save her kids. I also understand what the parents of Gaza are going through, because in 1998, when war returned to Ethiopia, my country, my children had to hide in a bunker to shelter from the bombardment. I experienced war both as a child and as a parent. I know how the children are feeling, and I know how the parents are also feeling. The children and parents of Gaza and Israel want and need the same thing that my family wanted and needed: peace and security. By the way, I never imagined that I would be the Director General of the World Health Organization, because my mother's prayer was to survive just one day. One day. Maybe I'm lucky. That's what this council was established to achieve: peace and security. But this crisis underlines once again the need for reform of the Security Council. I felt nostalgic, by the way, when I entered into the room, because I used to come here when I was foreign minister. It has long been my view that the Security Council no longer serves the purpose for which it was established. And reminding this with all due respect. It represents the real politic of the Second World War, not the 21st century. As a foreign minister, I was part of a group working on reform of the Security Council. I'm dismayed that no progress has been made. To remain credible, relevant, and a force for peace in our world, member states, especially the P5, must take seriously the need to reform the Security Council. And one ask.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Excellencies, thank you for giving me the opportunity to address this very important meeting of the Security Council. Mr. President, the health sector in Gaza is under attack. Hospitals are being deliberately targeted in a desperate attempt to force the civilian population out of Gaza. The last 24 hours saw the targeting of at least 4 hospitals in Gaza. Al-Shifa Hospital, with tens of thousands of people sheltering there. Al-Auda Hospital, where our ambulances were bombarded and the emergency paramedics miraculously escaped certain death yesterday. Also the Indonesian hospital and our Al-Quds Hospital. Mr. President, I had to rewrite this statement few times in the last few hours, as the situation around the hospitals is changing by the minute. Displaced people at the hospitals are getting shot at as we speak. During the last call with my colleagues at Al-Quds Hospital 2 hours ago, they told me that 20 people have been injured by direct firing at the hospital. 1 person has been killed. They are asking, what can they do? Where should they go? Thousands of innocent lives are under imminent threat of being killed. I'm calling upon the council members on behalf of the staff and volunteers of the emergency medical teams, the doctors and nurses who are besieged in Gaza hospitals, to do all you can to spare further deaths and sufferings. There are 14,000 displaced civilians at Al-Quds Hospital, in addition to 400 sick and wounded together with our medical teams and management. The main generator was shut off 2 days ago because of lack of fuel. Right now, there is a very serious risk that we will lose all the patients in the intensive care units and those children in incubators. Mr. President, I was prepared to inform the Council about the critical shortages of fuel, food, and water. But honestly, now our utmost concern is the direct threat to the lives of all those wounded and sick, together with tens of thousands of civilians, including thousands of children. They are looking at you, imploring you to act to stop another possible massacre unfolding. In addition to the imminent threat of being shot and killed, the 14,000 displaced civilians at the hospital are getting restless and desperate because of lack of water, food, and electricity. We are witnessing the spread of diseases and increasing infestation of wounds with worms and among children. A child was treated yesterday for eye infection. The doctor found worms in his eyes. Mr. President, the medical teams have left their families to help save the lives of the wounded and the sick, but many of them received the news of losing so many loved ones. Dr. Nabil, a board member and now a volunteer at Al-Quds Hospital, lost 36 members of his family. The chair of our board has lost 20 members of his family. One of the founders of PRCS lost in one day 20 members, and the next day another 13. The description of the situation at Al-Quds Hospital does not and cannot describe the absolute horrors, the trauma, and the psychological scars of sleeping every night under the terrorizing bombardment and not knowing whether they will be alive the next morning or not. Mr. President, PRCS is taking the main responsibility to receive humanitarian aid through the Rafah crossing and distribute it to humanitarian organizations and to the hospitals and shelters. What has come in so far represents less than what used to get into Gaza in 2 days. At the same time, there has not been any drop of fuel that entered Gaza, which is essential for every aspect of life, for hospital operations, for pumping water, for bakeries, for ambulances, and for the trucks which are transporting the humanitarian aid. If this prohibition on fuel continues, we will not be able to continue to receive this aid and distribute it. Furthermore, if no aid gets to the north of Gaza Strip, we will soon see infants dying because their mothers cannot feed them. Many people will starve and die of diseases. Mr. President, we call on the Security Council and the international community at large. 1, to ensure an effective and immediate ceasefire is enforced. To ensure fuel gets into Gaza immediately to prevent additional unnecessary deaths and sufferings. Increase humanitarian aid and ensure that unconditional humanitarian aid gets to the north of Gaza, where tens of thousands of people are still there and have no safe places to go to. Ensure respect for international humanitarian law and the protection of medical missions and civilians in all parts of Gaza. Ensure hospitals continue to function with the needed support of fuel, medicine, medical supplies, and to allow medical teams to enter Gaza to relieve the teams who have been working tirelessly 24/7 for the past 35 days. Mr. President, Excellencies, please listen to the cries of children soaked in blood and asking why, and what have they done, and why the world is so indifferent to their lives. I thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢
I thank
希拉尼先生
Mr.
刚才
Gilani
所
for
做
his
的
briefing.
通报。我现在请
I now
观察
give the
员
floor
国
to the
巴
permanent
勒斯坦
observer
常
of
驻
the
观察
observer
员
state
发
of
言。
Palestine.
Mr. President, I thank China, President of the Security Council, for convening this important meeting and for your leadership of the Council in these times of crisis. I also want to thank the briefers who have shared disturbing reflections on the facts of the catastrophic situation being faced by the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. Facts that should pain the human conscience. And to my brother Gilani, I want to convey through him our salutations to the heroes of the Palestine Red Crescent in carrying out their mission to save lives. As we speak here, hospitals have become Israelis' primary target. They are besieged and their vicinity bombed. But what we should say to them from the Security Council: stop the massacre. Anyone, WHO, can and must act now to stop these massacres. Mr. President, I'm an old man, old enough to have been born when the Nakba occurred, to have grown up in UNRWA tents and refugee camp alongside tens of thousands of Palestinians, and to have listened to the stories about our life before the Nakba, stemming from the vivid and wounded memory of my parents. My generation dedicated its entire life to putting an end to the Nakba. On this 75th anniversary of the Nakba, instead of seeing it end, we see images that remind us of the worst of our times. What will this generation in Gaza remember? The horrors, the massacres, the trucks carrying people, carrying lifeless bodies, and shattered hopes. They will remember walking with a small bag to fit the remains of life. Children injured, orphaned, traumatized, walking distances they should never explore, between death and displacement, between loss and loss. More rage and outrage, more pain and suffering, beyond what the human mind can comprehend, beyond what any human heart should have to bear. So much silence within, the noise of bombardments without. Our entire life, we scream but cannot be heard. How can you scream louder than all this death that surrounds you? How can you scream louder than the noise of the bombardments? I cannot bear these images of a human wave with no tears as their eyes dried up, with broken hearts. Small children carrying burdens that would break the shoulders of strong men, discovering the meaning of death before enjoying the taste of life. They are standing up, but everything else within them and around them has crumbled. The same suffering that traumatized my generation is now tormenting yet
another Palestinian generation. We often said at that time, if the world knew, if it had witnessed our pain, if it had seen an entire people being killed and uprooted, it would have never allowed it to happen. We were so wrong. It did not matter that the massacres in Gaza are being reported live. They were being justified by pundits and spin doctors with all kinds of excuses. The fog disputed eventually, but only too late, and positions became clearer, but not yet clear enough to reign in Israel to tell it enough is enough. To be fair, the killer never hid his intentions. He spoke of mighty vengeance and human animals, describing us, and declared he would impose a terrifying siege on 2.3 million people, more than half of them children, more than 1.1 million children, flagrant collective punishment of an entire people. He called for the release of 200 hostages while taking over 2 million hostages in the process. He demanded condemnation of the killing of 1,000 Israeli civilians and killed 10,000 Palestinian civilians in the process. He proclaimed his right to self-defense while occupying, colonizing, and denying every right to the Palestinian people, including our right to self-determination and to protection and to defend ourselves. He preached of the need to prevent the destruction of Israel while continuing his campaign to destroy Palestine. He rejected any insinuation that Israel was not upholding the laws of war while committing war crimes and crimes against humanity on camera, and while his representatives were unable to hide their genocidal intent. Bombs dropping everywhere, north, south, east, and west. Bombs dropping on schools, universities, hospitals, UN shelters, cars, convoys, people walking, ambulances, killing civilians, doctors, journalists, UN staff, humanitarian rescue teams. Where should Palestinians go? To the sea or out of the Gaza Strip? Israel begins surprise. Why are they staying? Why are they dying and not listening to them? Because our entire nation has experienced in its flesh the grand exodus. Even when facing imminent death, it hesitates before leaving. It is our national trauma. So they bomb and bomb and bomb civilians, children, and civilian infrastructure. They deprive our people of the objects essential for their survival. But don't you dare accuse them of forced transfer. Forget about the memo by the Israeli Ministry of Intelligence that says they want to displace us out of Gaza. Forget about the statement of their foreign minister about the fact Gaza would shrink after the war. Forget about the map that Netanyahu held in the General Assembly with Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, as part of Israel. Forget about the confession of Netanyahu that they intend to retain security control over Gaza. Forget the chants of their soldiers. Forget the speeches of their leaders. They are telling you, we just want the Palestinians to go south for their safety. Never mind that some Palestinians have made it all the way to Rafah and are still being bombed. What is south of Rafah? I wonder. They want us out of our country, out of our land. Their strategic enemy is the independence of our state, the freedom of our people. The only options they have ever given us: submit, leave or die, or in international legal terms, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, or genocide. Gaza has shown this is shocking terms. And in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Israeli occupation forces and settlers killed 350 Palestinians since the beginning of the year, half of them in the last month, and forcibly displaced hundreds more Palestinians, seizing large areas of land. Mr. President, the Security Council meets again. I count our meetings in Palestinian death, in devastations and destruction. We met first when hundreds of Palestinians had been killed. We met yet again when 11,000 have been killed in Gaza, including 4,500 children. We met, and you can hear in these halls, if you listen well, the shouts of our children under the rubble, abandoned by humanity. We meet as only a few hundred trucks have entered Gaza in 30 days, and 10 times more souls have left to the skies. Israel is allowing enough trucks to pretend it is not imposing the siege, but not enough to save lives. Israel is implementing imaginary humanitarian pauses whose only goal is to force people to flee, not to offer them some relief that their survival is guaranteed. Thank you, Mr. President.
感谢关切中国巴
I
勒
thank
斯
the
坦常
permanent
驻关切员
observer
的
of
发
the
言。
observer state
我
of
现在
Palestine for his
请以色
statement.
列代表发
I
言。
now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank you for your consideration in permitting me to address the Council earlier in light of the Sabbath. It is deeply appreciated. Thank you. Distinguished Council members, the Holy Jewish Sabbath is a day of peace and rest. It is the day on which God rested following the creation of the world. Yet, no Jew will ever forget the Sabbath of October 7th. It has been seared into the collective trauma of the Jewish people forever. Exactly 85 years ago today, another traumatic atrocity was burned into the Jewish people's history. Between November 9th and 10th, 1938, the Jewish communities of Germany and Austria suffered Kristallnacht, the Nazis' November pogrom, which was the first hyper-violent exposure of the Nazis' murderous Jew hatred. Nearly 100 Jews were murdered. Thousands of Jewish homes, hospitals, schools, houses of worship, and businesses were ransacked and burned to the ground. Israelis endured another such pogrom 5 weeks ago. Yet, here we are 34 days later, and this Council still has not condemned Hamas's heinous, planned massacre of Israeli civilians. Should this Council, in its current form, existed in 1938, I doubt that the response would be much different. Council members, today's briefing focuses on the targeting of hospitals. Just 2 days ago, Barzilai Hospital in Ashkelon suffered a direct, intentional hit from Hamas rockets. Hamas's intentional targeting of hospitals is a war crime. deliberate attacks on medical facilities, the murder of medical teams, paramedics, and ambulances sent to treat the wounded were rampant during the Hamas slaughter. Yet, these horrors have yet to be addressed by this Council. I urge the Council to invite me to share a screening of the footage from Hamas's slaughter, footage that the terrorists filmed themselves. Once you see the barbarity and savagery with your own eyes, you will understand the evil that Israel is defending itself against. Will you address these crimes today? Will you condemn Hamas for murdering Israeli medical personnel? Will you call out Hamas for torching Israeli ambulances? We have videos of Hamas Nazis shooting at ambulances to prevent any attempt to save innocents. Will you call out Hamas for indiscriminately firing rockets at Israeli hospitals? After all, this has been Hamas's modus operandi for years. For years. Will this be the focus of this meeting? What about Hamas's exploitation of hospitals, ambulances, and medical clinics for terror in Gaza? Will this be raised in today's meeting? Over the past week, Israel has exposed to the world that the Hamas Nazis' main command headquarters is located within and under Shifa Hospital. We have provided footage of terrorists existing tunnels adjacent to and underneath hospitals. We have shown videos of Hamas ISIS using ambulances as a means of transporting weapons and terrorists. We have shared intelligence, including phone calls between terrorists, stating that they not only are located under and inside hospitals, but that they also control the fuel supply to medical centers, which they exploit first and foremost for their terror activity. We have shared footage of Hamas terrorists who openly admit that Shifa Hospital and other hospitals serve as bases and that ambulances are used as taxis for terrorists. These terrorists make it clear that Hamas co-opts these vehicles and sensitive locations for their war machines, as they know that Israel will not attack them. Over the past 16 years, Hamas has turned every inch of Gaza into a terror trap. Nothing is sacred to these jihadist Nazis. Every medical worker, doctor, and patient in Gaza is a human shield for the Hamas terrorists. This is abominable. It is a war crime of epic proportions. Will this be the focus of today's meeting? How can we possibly hold a briefing on the medical situation in Gaza without making this the primary issue of this meeting? For weeks, Israel has asked all civilians to temporarily evacuate northern Gaza. We have dropped leaflets. We have made phone calls. We have sent text messages. For days, there has been designated corridors for civilians to evacuate south. Israel is providing safe passage for Gazan civilians to leave an active war zone, while Hamas is actively working to prevent civilians from leaving. In footage that surfaced today, Gazan civilians were waving white flags as they tried to leave Al-Nasser hospital, yet they were forced to stay after Hamas opened fire on them. Israel is at war with Hamas, and we have gone above and beyond to mitigate civilian casualties. For Israel, life is sacred. But yet, for Hamas, death is sacred, particularly civilian deaths. Will this be the focus of today's meeting? Will this Council condemn Hamas for these crimes? Over a week ago, Israel formed a task force to establish field hospitals in southern Gaza for all those in need. This team is in touch with countries around the world, and we are already seeing progress. There is no clearer proof that that Israel is doing everything possible to provide solutions to mitigate civilian harm, while Hamas is committed to murdering both Israeli and Gazan civilians. Israel is fighting a war that it did not start or want. On October 6th, there was a ceasefire in place. Yet, Hamas violated that ceasefire with the brutal slaughter, rape, and burning of 1,400 Israelis. Despite their unbelievable claims otherwise, Hamas is fully responsible for the situation in Gaza. They are fully responsible for Gaza's civilian population. They are fully responsible for Gaza's resources, and they are fully responsible for exploiting hospitals and ambulances as weapons of terror. While Hamas must be held fully accountable, there is another body, sadly, that is complicit, the UN. Colleagues, for years, I have warned this Council of the briefings you receive, the numbers, statistics, and events that are provided to this Council by UN officials. Yes, such as Dr. Tedros, such as Mr. Lazzarini of UNRWA, such as Mr. Griffith of OCHA, from all the other libelous UN organizations, committees, and also, sadly, from the Secretary General himself. They do not reflect the situation on the ground. Yes, diplomatic niceties require us to thank them for their work, but sadly, they are relaying falsehoods that are completely detached from reality. For years, the UN has refused to establish verification mechanisms that can provide us a truthful picture of reality. WHO is it that supplies the UN with these so-called facts. Who is it that supplies the UN with these so-called facts? Is this information coming from unbiased and impartial third parties? The answer is no. Every piece of information regarding the situation on the ground that this Council receives comes from Hamas, not international UN employees in Gaza. I will remind the Council that Hamas, a genocidal terror organization, controls every facet of Gaza. Every number from the so-called Ministry of Health is Hamas. Many UNRWA workers in Gaza are themselves members of Hamas. The time has come to bust the myth of UN-supplied facts. This Council is being spoon-fed lies by the very same terrorist organization that deliberately murdered and maimed thousands of innocent Israelis just 34 days ago. Hamas has ensured that every square meter of Gaza is under their complete reign of terror. Many ambulances drivers are Hamas members. Local contributors to international media are Hamas members. We saw this week that innocent photojournalists for Reuters and the New York Times not only documented Hamas's horrors, but crossed into Israel to film them with the terrorists themselves. Hamas rules all of Gaza with an iron fist, and Hamas also rules all of the information coming out of the Strip. Just because briefings are written on official UN documents, it doesn't change the fact that the content was based on information supplied by Hamas. Hamas knows that this Council ingests their poisonous falsehoods. This is part of their script. Their very own terror operatives give libelous information, which cannot be, sadly, verified by anyone other than Hamas to UN bodies. This information is passed on to UN officials, and then this information is used to brief you. Is it not concerning to you that in Dr. Tedros' briefing, not once did he mention Hamas exploitation of hospitals and ambulances for terror? Should this not raise a red flag? We are also being briefed by the Palestinian Director General of the Red Crescent. Yet, there is no Israeli representative of Magen David Adom, the Israeli Red Cross, briefing the Council. Is this not mind-boggling? Does this not reek of bias? Do Israeli lives matter less? Are the hostages, including women, children, toddlers, and the elderly, not worthy of this Council attention? How about the trauma of tens of thousands of Israelis, or the thousands of wounded Israelis still being treated in hospitals, or the hundreds of thousands of Israelis who have been forced to leave their homes since the massacre? Mr. Gilani, why don't you tell the Council about the ambulances that Hamas abuses for transporting terrorists and weapons? Or is this an inconvenient truth that you choose to stay silent about? When the parking lot of El Ahli Hospital was hit by a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket, the WHO jumped on the opportunity to falsely condemn Israel. Yet, even though it has been proven beyond a fraction of a doubt that Palestinian terrorists were responsible, no effort has been made by the WHO to change the label they immediately adopted. We all remember that within minutes of the Islamic Jihad rocket attack on El Ahli Hospital, the Hamas Ministry of Health immediately reported 500 fatalities. We now know that this number was a total lie, but still UN bodies still rely on such fabrications. Stop believing Hamas falsehoods, I beg you. Last week, we were shocked to hear Dr. Michael Ryan, the executive director of the WHO Health Emergency Program, call on Gazans to remain in hospitals that serve as Hamas terror bases. By adopting Hamas narrative of evil and telling patients to remain in an active war zone, the WHO prefers to endanger the lives of Palestinians rather than save them. What is even more shocking is that Dr. Rick Peppercorn, the WHO representative for Gaza, has until today refused to be briefed by Israel. We have urged Dr. Peppercorn numerous times to speak with us about the undeniable subterranean city of terror underneath Shifa Hospital, yet we received no answer. Instead, Dr. Peppercorn and WHO prefer to parrot Hamas lies while denying to speak to any Israeli experts. WHO teams have made it clear that they prefer to reward Hamas's strategy of exploiting hospitals, and by doing so, the WHO is directly complicit in giving impunity to this despicable practice. Dear colleagues, Israel is taking action to mitigate civilian casualty. We prefer to take proactive steps because, unlike Hamas and UN bodies, we cherish life and hold it sacred. This is why Israel is in advanced talks with the United Arab Emirates, with the ICRC, and with other European countries regarding the establishment of field hospitals and floating hospital ships. Israel facilitated the Jordanian airdrop of medical aid to hospitals in northern Gaza. Thousands of tons of medical equipment and supplies have already entered Gaza. Israel constantly shows that it is willing to take any step to evacuate the wounded from the war zone of northern Gaza to safer areas in the south. Sadly, Israel is doing far more for the well-being of Gazans than the WHO or any other UN body. Yet, this is not the focus of this meeting. If any UN official truly cared for Gazans, they would be working hand in hand with us to advance solutions, not condemn Israel for the measures taken to provide safety. Distinguished Council members, Hamas is supplying all of the information, I reiterate. Israeli experts are either ignored or baselessly mistrusted, and verified facts, including video, audio, and intelligence-based information, are deliberately omitted from your briefings. The words of genocidal terrorists are accepted at face value, while the irrefutable evidence of a law-abiding democracy is tossed aside. Tragically, the UN mechanisms have become terror enablers. We must no longer accept this. Colleagues, while Israel is at war with Hamas, and only with Hamas, we are also defending ourselves against murderers, numerous other terror threats. Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard in Syria. These are all tentacles of the same genocidal octopus, Ayatollah regime in Iran. The Ayatollah has publicly praised the October 7th massacre, and Iran has armed, funded, and trained all of the terror groups attacking Israel. Nevertheless, the foreign minister of this murderous regime visited the UN only a week and a half ago and was given the red carpet treatment. He was loudly applauded in the General Assembly and even met with the Secretary General, who shook his hand with a big smile. The UN has completely lost its moral compass. This cannot be tolerated. Mr. President, Israel is fighting a war for her very future and existence. We are combating a genocidal Nazi-like terror organization. Hamas has publicly declared that they will carry out further atrocities if they are given the chance. The only way to ensure that these horrors are never repeated again is by eliminating Hamas capabilities. And this is the realization of our collective oath of never again. Israel will continue targeting Hamas while working towards solutions for Gazan civilians. This should be the focus of this meeting and not anything else. Thank you, Mr. President.
I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I now give the floor to the representative of the UAE.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I'd like to also thank you in leading us in a moment of silence for the lives lost in Israel and the OPT. By now, we've all heard the acronym coined by health workers in Gaza, WCNSF, which stands for Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. I just want to let that sink in as we discuss today's topic. Dr. Tedros and Dr. Gilani, I want to pay tribute to both of you, not only for making time to brief this council, but also for the life-saving work you and your teams do on the ground in very, very difficult circumstances, and your clarion call to this council today that must be heeded. Today, I also want to pay tribute to the silent heroes in the medical community in Gaza who stayed behind to deliver life-saving assistance despite these horrific circumstances. Just moments ago, many of us received messages from medical and humanitarian organizations about the heavy fighting around the Al-Shifa hospital. Medical staff tell us that they're in fear of their lives and the lives of their patients being taken, and they do not know if they will make it until the morning. Mr. President, it sometimes feels that by only dealing with the numbers from the conflict, we are indeed denying the humanity of those suffering. While it is impossible for us to go through the thousands of stories in today's meeting, I want to put a couple of faces to those numbers. Not of Hamas fighters, normal people. And Israel may be at war with Hamas, but those paying the price of this war are civilians in the thousands. Let me start with Ala Zahir Ahmed, who's in her third year of medical school. She grew up in Khan Yunis refugee camp. On the 10th of October, she was designing a poster for breast cancer awareness when the windows started shaking and everything turned black. An Israeli airstrike leveled her home, pinning her legs under the wreckage and leaving barely enough oxygen to breathe. Hours later, Ala's relatives and rescue workers pulled her from the rubble. They also recovered the lifeless bodies of her mother, her brother, and her nephew. And there are so many stories like this one. I feel the need to remind the Council that, like Ala, every single one of the 2,650 currently reported as trapped under the rubble are human beings, and that more than half of them are children. But they're not just children, they're Palestine's future, and they're also Israel's future neighbors. And we should spare no effort to protect them and save both peoples from this road of war that we are on. Born in Al-Shifa Hospital on 6th October is Talia, whose fragile heartbeat depends on a mechanical ventilator, straining generators, and dwindling fuel supply. with the strike on the hospital last night and reports of the desperate evacuations on foot as we speak here today in this council, I can't even begin to imagine what has happened to Talia, but we must not turn away from these stories. Like Talia, there are 130 other premature babies that are reliant on incubators to breathe. They are also reliant on our work here in this chamber as well as in our region. As we called for this meeting yesterday, little did we know that by the evening, a terrifying barrage of targeted attacks would be launched on schools and hospitals. Here's what that actually means. Babies, children, and the elderly who are seeking refuge and care in those facilities are also under attack. There are over 110,000 patients, including children, suffering from burns to their faces so severe that they're suffocating, with no access to antibiotics or burn cream. Women are giving birth in the most unsanitary conditions known to mankind, without medicines, and C-sections are being performed without anesthesia. The perverse reality of the situation in Gaza is that wounds inflicted by the most technologically advanced weaponry of the 21st century are being treated in conditions that are reminiscent of medieval times. To help alleviate this suffering, the UAE is establishing a field hospital in Gaza, working in solidarity with Gaza's medical personnel and in cooperation with Israel. But it's a plaster on a fracture. There can be no doubt that the attacks by Israel in pursuit of its security are disproportionate. They are cruel, and they are inhumane, and we condemn them. Also, they will not bring Israel security. So many lives are being lost without even achieving this aim. We must also not forget that those held hostage in Gaza by Hamas, many of them children, are also suffering under the same bombardment and psychological trauma, and they must be released immediately. We are witnessing the making of a lost generation of children and youth, physically and mentally scarred by these experiences. Indiscriminate attacks on civilians and civilian objects are prohibited by the laws of war. This simply cannot be part of any military strategy, defensive or otherwise. There is no state that would be condoned for conducting a military operation under those terms. Israel must end its siege of Gaza and reinstate essential services and items indispensable to human survival, including fuel, electricity, and water. Mr. President, it is not enough to simply demand humanitarian access anymore. While we must continue to call for compliance with the basic rules of international humanitarian law, as a matter of conscience, as many have said, we all know that without accountability or enforcement, this will never happen. At the bare minimum, we need to activate all the possible tools, including sustained and multi-day humanitarian pauses or truces, not least to end the suffering of children. This can also enable a humanitarian surge, the safe movement of civilian and aid workers, conditions for access to and safe release of hostages. This is fundamental for the necessary goal, a durable and sustained ceasefire. It is unconscionable that it has been 33 days of the destruction of Gaza without any Council action and response. It is time to act and to respond and help save innocent lives. And to ensure this violence ends once and for all, this two-state solution must be the overarching goal. The international community must reiterate its unwavering support for this goal. This is the only solution that takes us out of this cycle of hatred and violence and dehumanization again and again and again. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the UAE. I now give the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Director General Tedros and Director General Marwan Gilani for your briefing today and for your dedication over the past few weeks amid extraordinary challenges. At the top, let me emphasize that we are closely monitoring the situation at the hospitals in Gaza. We are deeply concerned for the well-being of civilians who are at these facilities and rely on them for life-saving care and shelter from the violence. All civilian and humanitarian facilities, especially hospitals and medical facilities, as well as the people who work for them and are engaged exclusively in medical duties, must be respected and protected consistent with international law. We know that hospitals are in desperate need of fuel. The United States has been working tirelessly to put in place mechanisms to enable the fuel to reach hospitals and to meet other urgent needs in the South. These mechanisms need to be operationalized without delay, and much more work remains to be done to meet humanitarian needs throughout Gaza. But I also want to make clear that we share Israel's concerns about Hamas's hoarding and siphoning of fuel in northern Gaza. This is unacceptable, and we must all call it out. We also must call out the fact that Hamas cynically and atrociously uses Palestinian civilians as human shields, putting its command posts, weapons, and ammunition within or beneath the very hospitals we are speaking about today, and in residential buildings, schools, mosques. Hamas does not try to protect Palestinian civilians. It deliberately and callously endangers them. At the same time, these cowardly tactics do not diminish Israel's responsibility to distinguish between civilians and terrorists in its fight against Hamas. How Israel responds to Hamas attacks matters, and Israel's response must be consistent with international humanitarian law. Rules like proportionality and precaution still apply. And the risks of harm to civilians at sites that Hamas is using for military purposes absolutely have to be considered when planning an operation. Colleagues, acknowledging one party's suffering does not negate or detract from another's. We must not look away from the pain and suffering of innocent Palestinians. More than 1.5 million Palestinians who have been displaced in the weeks since October 7th. Innocent civilians have been killed, and people are in dire need of humanitarian assistance. Palestinian families are grieving, and we grieve with them. Our capacity for empathy also requires that we mourn the Israeli civilian lives lost on October 7th. The pain and suffering of families who wait to know the fate of more than 200 civilians, women, children, the elderly, still held hostage by Hamas. Israelis are also grieving, and we too grieve with them. I want to repeat, acknowledging one party's suffering does not negate or detract from another's. That was the message Secretary Blinken delivered during his recent trip to the region, his second in the last 3 weeks. At every stop, Secretary Blinken had candid and direct conversations about Israel's right to defend itself against Hamas terrorist attacks. He underscored the need to protect civilians consistent with international humanitarian law and to surge additional humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. He emphasized U.S. support for humanitarian pauses to facilitate and expand aid delivery. And he reiterated the importance of ending this current conflict in a way that ensures lasting peace and security in the region. Colleagues, although we may have different views and positions on certain necessary steps to achieve these objectives, I think it is clear we are all committed to work toward these ends. In particular, we all agree that much more also needs to be done to make sure that humanitarian assistance reaches those in need. President Biden and Secretary Blinken have worked tirelessly over the last month with Israel, Egypt, the UN, and others to facilitate the flow of fuel, food, water, medicine, and other humanitarian supplies into Gaza. Despite these efforts, the quantity of assistance entering Gaza is nowhere near enough to meet the dire and growing needs, and we are working to urgently scale up aid deliveries. Israel has committed to implement 4-hour pauses in areas of northern Gaza each day, with an announcement to be made 3 hours beforehand. We have been told by the Israelis that there will be no military operations in these areas over the duration of the pause, and that this process is starting today. We urge that these pauses be implemented without delay, and we emphasize that coordinating these pauses with the UN would help ensure aid reaches those in need. Moreover, we continue to support calls for extended humanitarian pauses. And we are hopeful that Israel's announcement will allow for the increased flow of humanitarian assistance into Gaza and will enable the safe passage of civilians seeking to flee the violence in northern Gaza. The United States will continue to lead, but it will require a collective effort from all of us to meet the soaring needs in Gaza. It is time to step up and to support the efforts of the UN. The UN is playing an essential role in the humanitarian response effort, and that work has come at great cost. Nearly 100 members of UNRWA have lost their lives. It is tragic, and thousands are putting their lives on the line every single day to help the people of Gaza. I want to underscore the United States' support for UNRWA's work and convey our condolences to those who have lost loved ones who are trying to help others, and our admiration for those who continue to carry out this vital work. We unfortunately do not yet have a way forward to secure the release of hostages, but we are working very hard on one. And if that were to take place, just being able to move hostages around the battlefield in a way that is safe will take time. And so, we believe a pause would also be appropriate in this context. Colleagues, even as we are consumed by this crisis, we must also work to chart a more peaceful future. President Biden has been very clear that we cannot go back to the way things were before October 7, either in Gaza or in the West Bank. And he has said we need to get back to the urgent work of advancing concrete progress towards a viable Palestinian state that includes both Gaza and the West Bank. The United States continues to believe the most viable path, indeed the only path, to peace is through a two-state solution. As Secretary Blinken made clear this week, the only way to ensure that this crisis never happens again is to begin setting the conditions for durable peace and security. That means there must be no forcible displacement of Palestinians from Gaza, not now and not after the war. Gaza cannot be used as a platform for terrorism or other violent attacks. There must be no reoccupation of Gaza after the conflict ends or attempt to blockade or besiege Gaza. And there must be no reduction in the territory of Gaza. Finally, we must also ensure no terrorist threats can emanate from the West Bank. Adhering to these principles and achieving a two-state outcome is the only guarantor of a secure and democratic Israel, the only guarantor of Palestinians realizing their legitimate aspirations to live in a state of their own, enjoying equal measures of security and prosperity, the only way to end this violence once and for all. Again, our capacity for empathy, our common humanity, that is what separates us from Hamas and other terrorists. We can and must acknowledge one another's suffering and keep working together to alleviate the human suffering created by this conflict. And we can and must work toward a more peaceful and secure future for Israelis and Palestinians alike. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, colleagues, I thank the United Arab Emirates and China for calling for this open briefing on the health emergency in Gaza. I also thank Dr. Tedros Ghebreyes and Dr. Marwan Gilani for their briefings and commend them and their teams for their tireless work on the war-torn ground of Gaza. Brazil remains deeply concerned about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, marked by a disturbing increase in civilian casualties, particularly among women and children. The loss of thousands of children's lives is appalling. Children must be protected from hostilities. In President Lula's words, innocents are called upon to pay the price for the madness of war. This must stop at once. Brazil urges the Israeli authorities to exercise immediate military restraint and to respect the principles of distinction and proportionality in order to protect civilian lives and infrastructure. We also call on Hamas and all other groups to cease all indiscriminate attacks on Israeli territory. Hospitals and UN facilities have been indiscriminately attacked with an appalling number of civilian casualties, including of essential personnel such as aid workers, UN personnel, as well as journalists. Brazil calls for the protection of all medical facilities, professionals, patients, and the wounded in accordance with international humanitarian law. We also call for the safe medical evacuation of those who are seriously injured or ill. Despite the risks, UNRWA's delivery of essential emergency medical supplies from the WHO to Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City on 8 November is a step in the right direction. But we share Dr. Tedros and Mr. Lazarini's concern that it is not nearly enough to meet the overwhelming needs in Gaza. Medical supplies in Al-Shifa are critically low, and fuel shortages have become critical. We hope that the long-awaited announcement of daily humanitarian pauses in northern Gaza will facilitate the delivery of aid to civilians. As highlighted by the United Nations, the hundreds of thousands who remain in the north are facing a dire humanitarian situation as they struggle to find even minimal amounts of water and food to survive. We call for full, safe, and sustained humanitarian access to distribute essential supplies on a much larger scale, more frequently, and in greater quantities. Mr. President, besides a humanitarian ceasefire, all parties must also commit to a cessation of hostilities, which is essential for the long-term protection of all civilians. We remain deeply concerned about the fate of all hostages and call for their immediate release. Their safety, well-being, and humane treatment in accordance with international law must be guaranteed. The ICRC must be granted access to all hostages without further delay. This crisis poses a significant threat to international peace and security and has the potential to escalate into a wider conflict. 1 month into this crisis, it is clear that diplomatic efforts have failed to match the gravity of the situation. The international community must act swiftly to create the conditions for a lasting solution. Violence will not provide the answers. Yesterday in Paris, at the International Humanitarian Conference for the Civilian Population of Gaza, Brazil stressed the importance of convening a conference that can promote a political solution to this decades-old conflict with the participation of a large number of states, such as the case of the 2007 Annapolis Conference. Ignoring the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination has had an unacceptable toll of human lives and human suffering on both Palestinians and Israelis. The recognition of a viable Palestinian state living side by side with Israel within secure and mutually accepted and internationally recognized borders is the only possible solution. It is highly time we go back to this path with true political will and real diplomacy. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil. I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
My delegation
thanks the Director General of the World Health Organization for his briefing and for all the information made available to us. We listened closely to the statement made by the Director General of the Palestine Red Crescent Society on the devastating situation of the people of Gaza. For 35 days now, we have witnessed a terrifying escalation of violence. The primary victims of this violence are children. We saw this first of all on Israeli soil with the barbaric attacks of Hamas conducted on the 7th of October. We then saw this in Gaza, where for more than a month now, no one is safe anywhere. But we've also seen such violence in the occupied West Bank. The implementation of the resolution adopted on the 26th of October by the UN General Assembly is, as a consequence, a matter of urgency. The gridlock in which the Security Council currently finds itself defies all logic and is absolutely unfathomable. It is time to find a solution to end this chaos. It is of the utmost importance that our Security Council overcome its geopolitical and political stumbling blocks. My country calls upon the humanity of all of us. We sincerely hope that a consensus will be found quickly so that the Security Council can prove itself able to discharge the mandate bestowed upon upon it. Gabon reiterates its fervent condemnation of all deadly indiscriminate violence and is deeply shocked by the countless strikes on schools, hospitals, ambulances, as well as on refugee camps. The attack on Tuesday against the ICRC convoy when it was traveling to deliver vital medical supplies to Gazan hospitals is unacceptable. These flagrant violations of international law and of international humanitarian law are unjustified, unacceptable, and must, as a result, stop. In this same vein, all acute shortages of basic commodities, foodstuffs, water, electricity, fuel, and medicine cannot continue. The unimpeded, safe and sustained supply and distribution of essential goods and services to millions of people in need is of the utmost importance. We note with interest the decision taken by the Israeli authorities to, since yesterday, put in place daily pauses in the north of the Gaza Strip. We recognize the work of the authorities of the USA, Qatar and Egypt. Mr. President, Gabon wishes to reaffirm that the cessation of hostilities is the only solution to this rampant humanitarian crisis. Only a cessation of hostilities will be able to guarantee the protection of all civilians in Gaza, including the safety of Israeli hostages who are detained there, hostages that must be released unconditionally. It is only by silencing the weapons that rescue and recovery operations of children, namely those trapped under the rubble, will be able to be conducted. It is only by silencing the weapons that humanitarian actors will be able to identify need and organize the temporary care of unaccompanied children, children that have been separated from their parents or who have become orphans. In this regard, we recall the crucial role played by countries that have influence over the parties involved. We hail the commendable initiatives already undertaken by all of these countries to mitigate the humanitarian impact of the conflicts. These include the International Humanitarian Conference that was held on the 9th of November in Paris and the OIC Summit, which will take place on the 12th of November. Gabon will take part in that summit. We strongly encourage these countries that have an influence to bring to bear over the parties, to step up efforts to encourage de-escalation and the search for peaceful solution. Peace and stability in the Middle East are goals that we must all tirelessly pursue. Finally, Mr. President, the root causes of this conflict that have for years damaged the relations between Israeli and Palestinian people cannot be dissociated from the current situation. I reiterate Gabon's commitment to the two-state solution, two states that must coexist peacefully side by side on the basis of internationally recognized borders. To conclude, my country reaffirms its conviction that diplomacy, dialogue and negotiation are essential channels through which to achieve a lasting solution to this conflict, a solution which would guarantee the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and Israel's legitimate right to security. We reiterate our support for Secretary General Antonio Guterres and for all of his initiatives. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, pour l'organisation de cette réunion ouverte, mais aussi pour le moment de silence que nous avons pu dédier à toutes et tous les victimes. Je souhaite également remercier le directeur général de l'OMS, Dr Ghebreyes, et M. Marwan Gilani, directeur général du Croissant Rouge palestinien, de leur travail dans les circonstances les plus difficiles et de leur présentation qui rend compte de l'extrême gravité de la situation actuelle. La Suisse est profondément préoccupée par l'impact du conflit sur les civils, femmes, hommes et enfants, et sur les infrastructures civiles dans la bande de Gaza. Les civils ont un besoin urgent de protection et d'assistance. La situation sanitaire continue de se dégrader très rapidement pour la population civile, dont le 1,5 million de personnes déplacées se trouvent depuis plus d'un mois complètement assiégées, privées d'eau, d'électricité et de services essentiels à leur survie. Le droit international humanitaire protège la population civile et les biens à caractère civil. Il doit être respecté à tout moment, par tout le monde, en particulier les principes de distinction
Particular
de
respect must be
proportionnalité
given
et de
to the
précaution
principles
dans la
of
conduite
distinction,
des hostilités.
proportionality and precaution in
La
the
mission
conduct of
médicale, dont les
hostilities.
transports
Medical
médicaux,
missions,
les hôpitaux, les
including
cliniques
medical
et les
transport,
personnes qui sont
hospitals,
soignées,
clinics, and people
ainsi que
who
le
are treated
personnel
in them,
médical qui
as well as
travaille,
medical
jouit d'une
personnel who work
protection
in them,
spécifique
enjoy
en
special
vertu du droit
protection under
international.
international
Elle ne
law.
doit jamais être prise pour
They
cible.
must never be
Un
targeted.
convoi humanitaire du CICR
An
transportant du
ICRC
matériel
humanitarian
d'aide d'urgence
convoy
à
carrying
destination de
emergency aid
l'hôpital
supplies
Al-Quds
towards the
a essuyé
Al-Quds
des tirs
hospital
mardi
came
passé.
under fire
Cet
last
incident,
Tuesday.
et nous en
This
avons entendu d'autres,
incident, and we
illustre
heard this from
l'environnement
others,
dans
illustrates
lequel
the
les
environment
organisations
in which
humanitaires,
humanitarian
impartiales et
organizations,
parées d'un emblème
impartial
universellement reconnu,
organizations and
doivent
organizations
opérer à
bearing
Gaza.
a
Je
universally
rends hommage
recognized
aux dizaines
emblem
de
must operate
collaborateurs comme
in
ceux de
Gaza.
l'UNRWA ou du
I
Croissant
pay
Rouge
tribute to
qui
the
ont
dozens
perdu
of
la
their
vie
staff,
dans
such as those of
l'exercice de leurs
UNRWA and the
fonctions.
Red Crescent,
Nous notons
who've lost their
également avec
lives
la
in
plus
the
grande
cause of their
inquiétude les
duties. We
dégâts
also note with
réguliers
grave
sur les
concern the
hôpitaux
regular
tels
damage
que
done to
l'hôpital pour
hospitals,
enfants
such as
Al-Nasser.
the Al-Nasser Children's
Le
Hospital.
volume d'aide est
The volume of
insuffisant
aid
en
is
raison du manque de
insufficient due to
carburant.
the lack
Plusieurs
of
hôpitaux et
fuel.
cliniques
Several
ont dû
hospitals
cesser de
and
fonctionner.
clinics have
Il
had
est
to stop
essentiel que l'eau,
operating. It
la
is vital
nourriture,
that
les
water,
fournitures
food,
médicales
medical supplies,
ainsi que le
and
carburant
fuel
puissent
be
entrer.
able to
Par
enter.
ailleurs,
Moreover,
l'aide doit aussi
aid must
parvenir aux
also
centaines de
reach
milliers
the
de
hundreds
civils
of
se trouvant dans
thousands
le
of
nord du
civilians
Gaza.
who are still in the
La
north of
présidente du
Gaza.
CICR a
The president
souligné hier,
of the
à l'occasion de la conférence
ICRC
de Paris,
said
je cite,
yesterday at the Paris conference,
l'impératif
and I quote,
immédiat
the
est
immediate
de sauver des
imperative is
vies et de
to save
préserver
lives and preserve
l'humanité.
humanity.
Un accès rapide et
Rapid
durable à
and
l'aide
sustained
humanitaire et à
humanitarian
l'approvisionnement est
access and supplies
désespérément
are
nécessaire.
desperately needed.
Nous remercions la
We
France
thank
pour
France for
l'organisation de cette
organizing this
conférence.
conference.
La Suisse prévoit de
Switzerland
fournir
intends to
une aide
provide
humanitaire d'urgence
additional
supplémentaire à
emergency
hauteur de
humanitarian
90
aid
millions
to
de
the tune
francs
of
dans toute la
90
région.
million Swiss
Aussi,
francs
la
throughout
Suisse
the region.
continuera de
Moreover,
travailler au
Switzerland
sein de
will
ce
continue
Conseil
to
à la mise en
work within
place
this
de
council
mesures
to the
urgentes
establishment of
telles que
urgent
des
measures,
pauses ou trêves
such as
humanitaires
humanitarian
nécessaires
pauses
pour
or
garantir un
truces
accès
necessary
sûr,
to
rapide et
guarantee
sans
safe,
entrave
rapid,
à
and
l'assistance
unhindered access
humanitaire.
for humanitarian assistance.
Monsieur le Président, la Suisse
Mr.
a
President,
condamné dès le 7
since
octobre
the 7th of
dernier, et
October,
avec la plus
Switzerland
grande
has
fermeté,
condemned
les
in
actes
the
de
strongest
terreur
terms the
et
acts
toutes
of
les
terror
attaques
and the
indiscriminées
indiscriminate
perpétrées par le
attacks
Hamas
carried out by
contre les
Hamas
populations
against
civiles en
civilian
Israël.
populations in
La
Israel.
Suisse demande la
Switzerland
libération
calls for
immédiate
the
et inconditionnelle des
immediate and
personnes prises en
unconditional
otage
release
et
of those
actuellement
taken hostage
détenues
and
à Gaza.
currently detained in Gaza.
En même temps
At the
qu'elle
same
reconnaît le droit
time as it
d'Israël d'assurer
recognizes
sa défense et
Israel's
sa
right to
sécurité,
ensure
la
its
Suisse
defense and
rappelle que la
security,
protection des
Switzerland
civils
recalls
et
that
le
the
respect du droit
protection of
international
civilians and the
humanitaire
respect for
sont
international
obligatoires.
humanitarian
Le
law
respect du droit
are
international
obligatory.
humanitaire doit
Respect
rester
for
une priorité
humanitarian
de
law
ce
must
Conseil.
remain a priority of
Par
this
ailleurs, la
Council.
Suisse reste très
Moreover,
préoccupée par la forte
Switzerland
hausse de la
remains deeply
violence en
concerned by
Cisjordanie
the
occupée.
sharp increase in
Face à
violence in the occupied
l'augmentation de la
West
violence
Bank.
des colons,
In view
la
of the
Suisse
increase
rappelle
in
les
settler
obligations
violence,
d'Israël en
Switzerland
vertu du
recalls
droit international,
Israel's
y
obligations under
compris
international
l'obligation
law,
de protéger la
including the
population
obligation
civile.
to protect the
Il est
civilian
nécessaire que
population.
des enquêtes soient menées sur toutes les
Inquiries must be
violations du droit
conducted into
international
all
en
violations of
Israël et dans
international
l'ensemble
law
du
in
territoire palestinien
Israel
occupé,
and throughout
afin
the
que leurs auteurs
OPT
soient
so that
traduits en justice.
perpetrators can be brought to
Enfin,
justice.
ne
Finally,
perdons
let us
jamais de
not
vue
lose
que le
sight
seul
ever of the
socle
fact
sur
that the
lequel la
only
paix et la
foundation on which
stabilité
peace and
peuvent
stability
reposer
can be
est la
built
solution à
is
deux
the
États.
two-state
Deux
solution.
États
Two
démocratiques,
democratic states,
Israël et la
Israel and
Palestine, qui
Palestine,
vivent côte à
living
côte
side
en
by
paix
side
à
in
l'intérieur de
peace
frontières sûres
within
et reconnues.
secure and
Et c'est pour
recognized
cela
borders.
que nous
And
devons
it is for
toutes et
that
tous
reason that we
ensemble
must
nous
all
engager.
together
Je vous remercie.
work. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland. I now give the floor to the representative of
Je
France.
vous remercie, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie le directeur général de
I
l'OMS
thank
et
the
Monsieur
Director General
Gilani
of
de leurs exposés.
WHO and Mr. Gilani for their
Les attaques
briefings.
terroristes du Hamas et d'autres groupes
Terrorist
terroristes
attacks
contre
perpetrated by
Israël
Hamas and
le
other
7
terrorist
octobre
groups
dernier doivent
against
être
Israel
unanimement
on 7
condamnés et tous les
October
otages
last need
doivent
to be
être libérés
unanimously condemned and
immédiatement
all
et
hostages
sans
need to be
condition.
released
Chaque vie
immediately
compte.
without
Il n'y a pas de
preconditions.
poids de mesure.
All
Israël a le
lives rights are valuable. There can be no double standards. Israel has the right to defend itself and the duty to do so in a manner that respects international humanitarian law while preserving lives of civilians. Mr. President, Palestinian civilians lose their lives every day in Gaza. Palestinian children lose their lives every day in Gaza. We have heard today that they are also exposed to the worst possible sanitary conditions and heightened risk of epidemic. France France thanks the WHO for its initiatives on the ground. We also applaud the commitment of the UN Secretary General and the work of UN agencies, as well as humanitarian actors on the ground. We extend our sincere condolences to the United Nations after the death of 100 UNRWA personnel. The humanitarian situation is catastrophic, and we must act. To that end, France continues to call for an immediate, sustained, and lasting humanitarian truce, which should result in a ceasefire towards which we must all work. Unimpeded, lasting humanitarian access to the Gaza Strip must be provided as a matter of urgency. All checkpoints need to be opened. The number of convoys need to be commensurate with the needs. Civilian infrastructure and hospital need to be protected. In respect of IHL, there is a need to ensure the immediate restoration of basic services, inter alia, to guarantee access to water, sanitation, and electricity. The International Humanitarian Conference of Support for the Civilian Population of Gaza was organized in Paris yesterday at the initiative of our President, Mr. Macron, and this has resulted in more than 1 billion euros of financial contributions. Assistance from France for Palestinian civilian populations was 100 million euros. France also delivered 87 tons of humanitarian cargo. 30 tons of additional assistance will be delivered in the days to come as part of the air bridge of the European Union. The violence perpetrated by settlers against Palestinian populations have spread in the West Bank and has forced Palestinian communities to flee. This is unacceptable. France reiterates its call for Israeli authorities to bring an end to this. We call for preventing conflagration of the whole region. There is a need for safety and security of blue helmets, of UNIFIL, UNDAF, UNSO to be upheld. They continue to deliver upon their mandates. France is fully committed to avoiding a spread of the conflict, and we also condemn the Houthi strikes towards Israel. The world cannot disregard the legitimate aspiration of Palestinians and Israelis to live in peace and security. We all are aware of the conditions necessary for this lasting peace. These are the indispensable guarantees for Israel for its security and those of a state for Palestinians. There's a need to restore the political horizon. The only viable solution is a two-state solution, and this imperative must no longer be a prospect. It needs to become a reality. France will persevere with our constructive engagement at the Council to ensure that a resolution is adopted at the soonest. We owe this to the Israelis and Palestinians. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France. Now I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
I thank WHO Director General Dr. Tedros and Mr. Giuliani for your detailed description of the situation and personal stories with fear, pain, and loss. And I thank you and your team's dedication under this unimaginable situation. Mr. President, the situation in Gaza grows more desperate by the day, and time is of the essence. We greatly admire the humanitarian workers continue to work in incredibly dangerous conditions, and we lament the death of more than 100 UNRWA staff. Regrettably, the Security Council has remained silent for more than a month since the conflict broke out with the horrifying acts of terror by Hamas in Israel on 7th of October. The time of concrete action is now. To this end, Japan fully supports humanitarian pauses as well as humanitarian corridors to facilitate urgently needed assistance, civilian movement, and release of hostages. Full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access should be granted without delay and in a continuous manner. We welcome the tireless diplomacy by the international community, including the International Conference on Humanitarian Aid for Gaza held in Paris yesterday. Japan hopes that pauses announced by the US government on 9th November will contribute to enhanced delivery of life-saving humanitarian aid, protection of civilians, and release of hostages in Gaza. On our part, Japan, as the G7 presidency, hosted the G7 foreign ministers meeting in Tokyo this week, calling for urgent action to address the rapidly deteriorating humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The recently announced flash appeal requires $1.2 billion to meet immediate humanitarian needs in Gaza and the West Bank. Japan has been playing its part. Our foreign minister has recently announced that Japan is prepared to provide an additional humanitarian aid package of $65 million and emergency relief supplies through JICA, Japan's aid agency, in addition to the already decided emergency grant aid worth $10 million. We call on all member states and humanitarian partners to join this effort to alleviate the suffering of the people in Gaza. Mr. President, over 200 hostages, including many children, are still held by Hamas and other militants in Gaza. Hostage-taking goes against the fundamental principles of international law, and we unequivocally condemn it. We demand the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages. Their loved ones are waiting with increasing despair. The risk of regional spillover is very real. The situation in Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen are getting worrisome. Additionally, the rise in extremist settler violence committed against Palestinians is totally unacceptable, undermines security in the West Bank, and threatens prospects of a lasting peace. A single miscalculation of any of these fronts could lead to a disastrous regional conflict, and we must do all we can to stop this. This conflict has to end, and relevant parties need to return to negotiations towards finally achieving a two-state solution where both Israel and a viable Palestinian state live side by side in peace and security. In the short term, we should take all possible measures to bring about an early de-escalation of the conflict as a first step towards a durable peace. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Japan. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, both for organising this session and our moment of silence earlier. I'd also like to thank Dr. Tedros and Dr. Gilani, not just for your briefings, but for the life-saving work that you and your teams are doing. Colleagues, we're in no doubt. There is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And as Dr. Tedros set out, that humanitarian crisis is deteriorating day by day. Of course, we welcome the opening of the Rafah border, and we thank partners for their work in allowing foreign nationals to leave. But it is essential and urgent that more aid flows in the other direction, into Gaza. Access, both through Rafah and other crossing points, needs to improve so that aid can reach the people who so desperately need it. For this to happen, we must see humanitarian pauses that allow enough time for aid to be delivered to those who need it, and for hostages to be released. Fuel must be allowed to enter Gaza so that hospitals and water desalination plants can operate and for aid to be delivered. The pauses in northern Gaza are a first step, but any pauses in hostilities should allow sufficient time and security, both for civilians to move and for humanitarian aid to be delivered. Since the 7th of October, the UK has been firm in its support for Israel's right to self-defense following Hamas terrorist attacks against Israel. In this context, international humanitarian law is not a nice to have. International humanitarian law is what keeps humanitarian workers and medical staff safe to assist those in need and protects civilians and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, wherever possible. So we urge all parties to the conflict to take all possible steps to minimize harm to civilians, health and humanitarian workers, and to protected sites. And we express our condolences for each life lost. Finally, Mr. President, we have been clear that Israel must do more to prevent escalation in the West Bank. We welcome statements, including that made by Prime Minister Netanyahu, condemning settler violence. But we must see tangible action to bring perpetrators to justice. We also condemn attacks against Israel emanating from armed groups in the region. The UK Foreign Secretary was in Riyadh yesterday, where he discussed preventing regional escalation with the foreign ministers and representatives of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Lebanon, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, and the Palestinian Authority. The Foreign Secretary also reaffirmed the UK's unwavering commitment to a two-state solution. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of UK for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Mr. President, let me begin by thanking Dr. Tedros Ghebreyes and Dr. Marwan Jilani for their insightful but sobering briefings to the Council on the medical systems and situation in Gaza. As we have followed closely the unfolding events that have provoked this meeting, we continue to be distressed by the situation in the Middle East, and especially in the Gaza Strip, but also in the West Bank. The reported high number of children killed in the present conflict, as well as the continued holding of many as hostages, is deeply distressing. Besides the many deaths on both sides, 101 UNRWA staff have also been killed since the start of the war, which according to the United Nations is on record as the highest number in any conflict. The high intensity of casualties in the ongoing conflict should compel urgent action on the part of this Council to act to prevent the further death of civilians and humanitarian workers. Not unlike many other conflicts in the Middle East and elsewhere, the inability of this Council to reach a consensus on how to get the parties to end the hostilities has affected the ability to effectively undertake the delivery of humanitarian assistance, protect civilians, and ensure adherence to international law. We therefore hope that the Council can unite around a common approach to abate the hostilities and bring the warring parties to a peaceful resolution of the month-old war. Ghana notes the intention to allow a daily 4-hour humanitarian pause in the fighting in northern Gaza to be announced 3 hours before the pause begins each day. We believe more can be done and more should be done. We must also create urgent conditions for safe humanitarian corridors, for rescue and recovery operations, and safe passage for the wounded, sick children, pregnant women, and caregivers in conformity with international humanitarian law. Mr. President, war, no matter the cause and its circumstances, must be done in compliance with international law. Civilians and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and their personnel and medical systems, should be avoided as part of this conflict, either as shields by Hamas militants or as legitimate targets in attacking them. Water and fuel must be supplied and not hindered. We reiterate our call on countries that have a moderating influence over the parties to intensify efforts aimed at stopping the fighting and securing the release of all Israeli and foreign captives. We reiterate our call on the Hamas militia to heed the demand of the international community for the immediate and unconditional release of all captured civilians. Holding innocent civilian populations as captives is wrong and unacceptable, regardless of the motives. Mr. President, the economic cost of not acting to stop the war should not also be lost on us. We are concerned by an assessment released by the UNDP and ESQA, which states that at least 45% of all housing in the Gaza Strip have been damaged or destroyed by the bombardments. A month into the war against Hamas and Israel's near siege of Gaza, the gross domestic product in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip has shrunk by 4%, sending over 400,000 people into poverty, an economic impact unseen in the conflicts in Syria and Ukraine or any previous Israeli-Hamas conflict. The consequences of the economic devastation on top of the destruction of infrastructure, including the medical systems, could be great unless we act now. In conclusion, Mr. President, we must all be guided by the dire situation on the ground and by the desire of the international community to end the ongoing war, which has resulted in close to 12,000 human casualties on both sides and brought immense suffering to children who constitute over 40% of the fatalities, women and the aged who are the most vulnerable in Gaza. Our conduct and deliberations must reflect the expectations to help the parties to end the ongoing hostilities. We began this meeting with a minute's silence. That observance should galvanize us to silence the sound of guns, rockets, and missiles that have dominated over the lands of Israel and Palestine in the past month. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for his statement. Now I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me also thank WHO Director General Ghebreyes and Mr. Gilani for their briefing. We are grateful to them and to everyone working on the ground to deliver life-saving assistance to those in need. Mr. President, the traumatizing developments of the last 4 weeks have shattered the Israeli and Palestinian lives, have brought the region to the brink of a major catastrophe, while the ongoing dramatic developments remain utterly troubling. Hamas continues to ignore the call of the international community and of the United Nations to unconditionally release hostages, which it is holding illegally and without justification. It continues to throw its rockets indiscriminately on Israel, and its leaders rejoice of their massacres and keep repeating that they will do it over and over again. 1 million times, said publicly one of them. Albania stands firm with Israel in its legitimate right to self-defense against pure savagery, but in a proportionate manner and profoundly rooted in the law, and supports its and all efforts for the release of hostages. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Gaza needs no description. Despite some efforts and improved access deemed insufficient, the current situation is not sustainable. More than 800 trucks have crossed Gaza through the Rafah crossing, but much more is needed and much more should be done. Hospitals should be provided with critical supplies and must remain protected. Further, concrete, improved and urgent actions are needed. Food, water, medical supplies and fuel must be delivered. They should not go to Hamas and their fighters, but they cannot be denied to civilians. We have said it many times and want to repeat it again. Every response to Hamas and their fighting capabilities should be carefully and properly targeted and made with distinction and precaution. Civilians are not responsible for Hamas actions. They do not have to pay for the actions of terrorists and extremists. Civilians and the infrastructure they rely on, including hospitals, shelters and schools, must be protected. They cannot be used for other purposes and cannot be places where Hamas can hide or from where they can operate. Mr. President, while we understand that a terrorist organization should not be allowed to reorganize, regroup, ambush, or continue to kill, as they have shown what they are able to do, while there is fierce fighting against barbarism, there is need to keep and show the best of humanity. While there can be no equation whatsoever between the massacres of Hamas and the military actions of the Israeli army, we need to make sure that protection of civilians and the international humanitarian law do not remain just empty words, but serious commitments to be observed and respected, and which call for prompt and serious actions. The staggering losses in innocent human lives among Palestinians and the unbearable number of children killed are profoundly disturbing. Far too many innocent people are dying for nothing, caught in a war that is not theirs. This war against terror should not unduly punish those it means to save, those it needs to save. We welcome the 4-hour daily pauses and the safe passage corridors as a concrete step in the right direction. They need to be fully coordinated with the UN actors and their partners on the ground so that protection of civilians and humanitarian help becomes truly effective. We hear the UN humanitarian workers and their partners on the ground argue that this may not be enough. They must be heard. Mr. President, we praise and welcome all efforts made, in particular by the United States, to avoid the spillover of the conflict in the region. Whoever seeks to use the current situation to advance their goals and bring more conflict, more misery, more victims and chaos in the wider region should think twice. The well-known troublemakers and supporters of terror in the region, those who applaud, support and finance Hamas terror, and other cynical supporters of them should be held in check. But there is need for more. As soon as hostilities are over, Gaza, free of Hamas, should emerge with a renewed administration and political organization. It should be rebuilt through a collective solidarity effort. It is therefore urgent to do the utmost to revive the political horizon with a serious offer and plan for the two-state solution as the only viable prospect in a future region free of terror. Children of Gaza should not grow to become future fighters, but good citizens. They should not be raised with hate, but with tolerance and respect for others. They should be taught citizenship education, not propaganda and bigotry. This is an arduous and long road. It will require genuine and sustained efforts. But it may never happen if parties do not agree to get together with the strong help of the international community and design a path to peace, one that provides the Israelis with what they need, security and peace, and the Palestinians with what they want and deserve, their own state and freedom. If not, real and lasting change will not happen in the Middle East, and any appeasement will only delay in time the next confrontation. I thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Mr. President, I thank the Director General of the World Health Organization and the Director General of the Palestine Red Crescent Society for their timely briefings this afternoon. Those briefings remind us of the bleak prospects that we are facing in terms of this conflict. I wish to recognize and hail the heroic work of healthcare personnel who, as we speak, are risking their lives to save others in conditions unimaginable to those of us sitting comfortably here in New York. That was recalled to us by the Director General of the WHO when he referred to his personal experience. I also pay tribute to the healthcare personnel that have already lost their lives in this conflict, and I extend my condolences to their loved ones. Mr. President, all armed conflicts bring with them consequences for the health of the population affected. There are the direct consequences of the weapons used and the indirect consequences of worsening health conditions caused by the destruction of places and the suspension of the provision of basic services. The eruption of violence seen in the conflict zone since the terrorist attack perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th 7th of October is the most serious eruption of violence we've seen in decades, and consequently its humanitarian consequences are also immense. We condemn in the very strongest terms the use of civilians as human shields by Hamas and the indiscriminate launching of rockets. Moreover, we reiterate our condemnation of the death of civilians in Gaza as a result of bombing such as that seen in the area surrounding the Al-Shifa hospital in recent days, as well as the bombing of other health centers, such as those we've been informed about this afternoon. We stand in solidarity with the families of the victims. Civilian infrastructure, including health infrastructure, must never be a target. The International Committee of the Red Cross states that medical units such as hospitals and other infrastructure created for the provision of medical attention must be respected and protected in all circumstances. Medical units may not be attacked, and access to them may not be limited. Parties to an armed conflict must take measures to protect medical units from attacks, such as ensuring that they are not situated in the vicinity of military objectives. Healthcare personnel must also be respected and protected under all circumstances. The provisions of international humanitarian law must be respected at all times and by everyone. Upholding these provisions is not voluntary, and defying them brings with it grave consequences. Upholding them also includes the obligation of releasing hostages immediately and unconditionally. Moreover, humanitarian aid, including medicines, energy, water, food, and medical inputs, must reach those who need it in the quantity required and in a timely fashion. To ensure that this happens, it is vital that there be a humanitarian truce which is immediate, sustained, and upheld. It is impossible to supply hospitals or to distribute aid while hostilities continue. We praise all efforts to protect civilians and to avoid greater suffering. Initiatives such as the International Humanitarian Conference for Gaza held yesterday in Paris are worthy of praise. However, these efforts alone are not enough. We all have a responsibility, individual and collective. We must uphold that responsibility in good faith. It is urgent that those who have veto power reach agreements that allow them to act at this Council. Mr. President, I conclude my statement by imploring all once again to avoid violence spilling over to other areas and to avoid that violence causing the prospect of a peaceful, just and lasting solution to this conflict to grow ever dimmer. We must do everything in our power to serve that goal. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we wholeheartedly support the importance of convening of the UAE's initiative to convene a Security Council emergency meeting on the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. We thank the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Adhanom, and the Director General of the Palestine Red Crescent Society, Marwan Gilani, for their briefings on the situation in the Palestinian enclave. We highly value the selfless efforts of the representatives of the WHO and all humanitarian colleagues who are working on the ground under exceedingly dangerous circumstances. The briefers today provided information about the devastating magnitude of the humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip, and this cannot but be shocking. In the Palestinian enclave, there is a real humanitarian disaster unfolding, a tragedy of global proportions. The Israeli airstrikes have fully destroyed or damaged nearly half of residential buildings and vital civilian infrastructure sites. Over the past day, 4 Palestinian hospitals were bombed. 18 of 35 hospitals in the Strip have completely ceased to operate. 35 buildings were destroyed and another 165,000 were damaged. The list of buildings that have been destroyed or wounded are 221 schools, 42 UNRWA facilities, 7 churches, and 56 mosques. The leadership of UNRWA has reported that the victims of the bombings now include 101 staff of the agency. We are shocked and deeply outraged that the targets of the strikes are civilian objects, schools, hospitals, mosques, refugee camps. We emphasize that the deliberate strikes against civilian objects represents an egregious violation of international humanitarian law. Respect for IHL is an imperative. In all wars, there are laws. Any violence against civilians, the conduct of strikes targeting buildings, civilian infrastructure sites are categorically unacceptable. According to existing reports just this morning, the Al-Quds hospital, Al-Shifa, was struck, as was the Khalid bin al-Amanida mosque and Al-Ikhwas mosque. And these mosques are located in the southern part of the Gaza Strip, and this confirms the information that safe zones for civilians today simply do not exist in the Gaza Strip. The Strip has been enduring a brutal, complete blockade, as a result of which civilians are the main casualties. There's an acute shortage of medicine, food, fuel, hospitals lack beds. There's a lack of drinking water, which has spawned an acute worsening of the sanitary and epidemiological situation. The residents of the besieged area are receiving assistance from organizations including the Russian Federation, which is delivering humanitarian support to the population in the Gaza Strip today. On the 10th of November, the Russian Emergency Ministry has announced that it will send by plane to Egypt the 4th consignment of food and medicine. This will be 25 tons of food and medicine. Nonetheless, as we heard today from Dr. Tedros Adhanom and Marwan Gilani, despite the fact that the northern part of the convoy received humanitarian convoys, that is clearly insufficient to meet the colossal needs of the Gaza Strip. If meaningful measures are not taken to de-escalate, the consequences and fallout will continue to reverberate for decades to come. Mr. President, in the shadow of the tragic events in Gaza, there is the forgotten, volatile situation in the West Bank of the Jordan River, which has been consigned undeservedly to oblivion. And since the 7th of October, all major cities in the West Bank have seen an acute escalation of violence as a result of the operations of Israeli security forces and violent acts by settlers against Palestinian civilians, irrespective of what is happening in the Strip. The situation in the West Bank of the Jordan River in and of itself deserves close scrutiny by the Security Council. In clashes with Sahel units over the past month, 148 Palestinians died over the past month. For comparison, in the year 2022, according to UN data, 155 Palestinians died. More than 2,200 people have been wounded. Another 2,000 have been detained. The army is meting out collective punishment, the most significant component of which is the complete blockade of residential areas through the closure of all roads leading to it due to security concerns. Presently, access of the Palestinian population has been blocked to major transport arteries of the West Bank, and this has done significant damage to the local economy. There is ongoing systematic demolition of Palestinian homes that do not have a Israeli construction permits. These construction permits are virtually impossible for local Palestinians to receive. According to OCHA, since the beginning of the escalation of the conflict, humanitarian agencies have been reporting numerous acts of violence by Israeli settlers. Moreover, in October of this year, as a result of threats from settlers, nearly 2,000 Palestinians have been forced to leave their homes. The easiest, often target are the Bedouin communities, which are isolated. Turning to the Israeli police and army predictably is ineffective and futile. On the contrary, often security forces directly support the settlers in their illegal actions, or at the very minimum, they do not intervene to stop the violence. We emphasize the acts of violence against Israelis and law enforcement and human rights defenders, rather, who are not afraid to speak the truth about what is happening in Gaza. Mr. President, once again, we emphasize the inadmissibility and dangerousness of the escalation of the conflict. We believe that the first step in that direction would be a prompt ceasefire in the Israeli-Palestine conflict zone. Only this, and not certain short-term pauses. Only this is the only real measure that would help to avoid new casualties, that will ensure the delivery of the necessary humanitarian assistance to those in need, that would help the people of Gaza, and that would erect a bulwark against the further spread of armed confrontation and regional participants being dragged into this. The risks of global and regional confrontation in the region, with huge numbers of historically unresolved problems, conflict spots, and potential risks loom large and are strikingly clear. However, the Palestine-Israeli conflict is a key problem. Without resolution of this problem, there can be no hope for lasting peace in the Middle East. All recent years we've been talking, including during the monthly meetings of the Security Council on Middle East Settlement, we have been talking about the fact that casting into oblivion the entire international legal basis for resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will result in escalation, and then the entire world will have to undertake the effort to resolve it. Mr. President, the resolution to the Palestinian question by no means should be linked to attempts to expel the Palestinians out of their ancestral lands. There's a need for a meaningful, in-depth, fundamental solution to this protracted historical problem that is firmly rooted in the provisions of international humanitarian law. History shows that attempts to monopolize mediation functions results not in resolution of conflicts, but rather escalation thereof, and we are presently bearing witness to this reality. Washington's obstruction of peace initiatives for the cessation, for ceasefire in the Gaza Strip at this juncture, and its one-sided policy over the course of many years, which has been geared towards their preservation of, as they call it, status quo, and its Washington's so-called peace, quiet diplomacy, were, in fact, reflective of an unwillingness to implement everything that the parties and countries and peoples agreed to. An absence of any progress whatsoever in negotiations inevitably generated radicalization and conflagration. Once again, I wish to state, this in turn could fuel the spread of the conflict and an outbreak of other potential or dormant conflicts in the region. And we have repeatedly stated that the enhanced foreign military presence in the conflict zone, specifically American units and groups in the Eastern Mediterranean, the provocative, hawkish statements, are also part of the overall escalation, and this only escalates the tensions. We believe that resolution of the Palestinian problem on the well-known international legal basis speaks to the long-term space stabilization in the Middle East, that absent this is unrealistic, and without that, Israeli security cannot be achieved either. Today, more than ever before, there is a need to urgently resolve the objective of stanching the bloodletting, avoiding unilateral actions, including settlement, like absorption of the regions of the West Bank of the Jordan River, encroachment upon holy sites in Jerusalem, incitement to violence and terrorism. We especially emphasize the importance of Palestinian unity, and we also fully support the increasingly urgent call now for collective action on the part of influential international players. We also wish to emphasize the central role of states in the Middle East in resolving problems in the region. One cannot allow third parties to exploit the Palestinian-Israel confrontation to derail the positive trends that have been seen of late to normalize the situation in the Middle East region. Engagement and unity of the states located there and all stakeholders around the well-known Security Council endorsed international legal basis for resolution, alongside political will from Palestinians and Israelis for negotiations on comprehensive issues related to the final status. Therein lies the key premise for relaunching comprehensive peace process in the Middle East. Thank you.
I thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, Mozambique wishes to thank China, President of the Security Council, for convening this important meeting. We extend our profound gratitude to Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, Director General of the World Health Organization, for the valuable and moving testimony provided us on the health and humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. Yours is a moral voice that we have to listen to. We also thank Mr. Marwan Gilani for his comprehensive briefing. Mr. President, it is with heart broken that we follow the daily reports of incessant attacks on civilians, children, women, men, and aid workers and health workers, as well as the destruction of hospitals, schools, and other civilian infrastructures in Gaza. This is a horrifying situation that completely ignores the human cost of this crisis and that should be strongly condemned. The depriving of food, medicines, water, and electricity to a trapped civilian population as a result of military action compounds the gravity of the tragic humanitarian situation that worsens by the day. It is our belief that this monstrous calamity will further alienate the Palestinian people for generations to come and undermine efforts towards achieving reconciliation, peace, and stability in the region. We therefore reiterate our call for a full compliance with all international human rights law and international humanitarian law that include norms and rules for the protection of civilians and humanitarian assistance. An immediate ceasefire will, in our view, halt and minimize civilian deaths and the destruction of infrastructure. It will also ensure that aid could be delivered to Gaza and ensure that millions of innocent civilians in need could benefit from humanitarian assistance. as members of the United Nations, we embrace and fully abide by inherent right of individual or collective self-defense against other states or non-state actors envisaged by Article 51 of the Charter. But that right must be exercised in accordance with the same Charter, and I quote, shall not in any way affect the authority and responsibility of the Security Council, end of quote. So we are in agreement with those who claim that it is time for the Council to act. We therefore call for immediate and decisive steps to be taken to de-escalate the situation and to ensure sustained and unhindered access and safe delivery of life-saving aid. It is our collective duty to ensure the protection of all civilians, both in Israel and Gaza, who are the innocent and unjustified target of the conflict between the IDF and Hamas. We have unequivocally condemned the massacre of 7th October by Hamas. As a liberation movement for our own freedom and independence, our people have never resorted in their struggle to mass killing of innocent people, even those serving the oppressing machinery of colonialists. On the other hand, our people have had an unforgettable experience of being victim of mass killings, massacres, and incidences of crimes against humanity. First, in our condition as a colony, and then as a victim of aggression from the illegal regime in South Rhodesia, and later from the South African apartheid regime. But we have always stood firmly the ground of our just cause. Our conscience, therefore, tells us there is always a moral and legal dimensions to what states and non-state actors are bound to comply with to advance their legitimate causes. It is in this context that we find it important that we keep open the doors for peace, security, self-determination, and dignity for both the Israeli and the Palestinian peoples. We must pursue our efforts and consistently engage with the parties towards a sustainable and lasting solution. The recognized and long-standing need for a two-state solution with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security must be at the center of our efforts aimed at finding the path of peace and justice in the region. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank you, Dr. Tedros, for your very moving statement. And I also thank Mr. Gilani for his briefing on the humanitarian and health crisis in Gaza. Malta expresses grave concern at the continued deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Tens of thousands of injured, sick, and displaced civilians are sheltering in hospitals and schools, depending on their protected status under international law for safety. A relentless siege and daily aerial bombardments in one of the most densely populated places on earth means that there are no safe zones in Gaza. Yesterday's strikes against hospitals, including Al-Shifa, are deplorable. We emphasize once again that medical facilities, personnel, and ambulances are protected by international humanitarian law and should not be targeted. Just before this meeting started, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, informed us of active fighting in and around Al-Shifa Hospital. Inside, approximately 4,000 patients are in dire straits, not including those seeking shelter. The director of surgery has told us, and I quote, "We don't want to be killed here." As medical staff, they are staying for their patients and are desperately asking for our help. One of our roles in this chamber is to ensure medical staff can work without danger to their very lives. Meanwhile, the health system in the enclave is completely collapsed. The scarcity of medical supplies, fuel, water, and food are depriving people of the essentials for their survival and preventing treatment for severe wounds and illnesses. Critical patients are being operated on without anesthesia and on floors due to a lack of hospital beds. Compounding this situation is the severe damage to the water and sanitation infrastructure and the overall lack of nutrition available. This is leading to growing risks of severe disease for infants and children. Malta welcomes the Israeli government's announcement yesterday for daily pauses to ensure the safe operation of humanitarian corridors. However, we must also stress that to protect civilians in Gaza, longer sustained pauses are needed to allow for humanitarian actors to adequately access and address the rising needs of the civilian population. Such efforts must include urgent recovery operations for persons trapped under the rubble. Malta therefore reiterates its call for a humanitarian ceasefire and stresses the importance of adequate humanitarian pauses in leading up to this. We cannot speak of the humanitarian imperatives without adequately referring to the ongoing hostage situation. Over 200 people, including elderly, children, and even infants, are still being held against their will. Their families and friends suffer the agony of not knowing when or if they will be reunited with their loved ones. We reiterate our urgent demand for Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad to safely release all hostages immediately and unconditionally. Malta also reiterates its categorical condemnation of the unjustifiable terror attacks of 7th October by Hamas against Israel and her people, and the indiscriminate rocket fire which has continued to take place since. We underline Israel's right to protect its citizens from such acts of terror. We also stress that all actions to this end must be in line with international humanitarian law, including principles of distinction, proportionality, and military necessity. Malta also remains concerned at the threat of regional spillover of this conflict. This is particularly worrying in the West Bank, where violence and unrest has increased this past month. We call on all parties to avoid any actions or inflammatory rhetoric which can further inflame tensions during this heightened period. Forced displacement of Palestinians and related settler violence must also cease. President, I cannot fail to mention UNRWA's tireless work this past month, which has come at great cost of lives of over 100 heroic workers. We fully support the agency through these difficult times and underscore its dire need for funding. UNRWA was and remains a stabilizing force in the region. It is one of the only beacons of hope for the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. It is crucial that we continue to support it. In closing, President, Malta underscores its commitment to a lasting and sustainable peace in the Middle East, based on a two-state solution in line with the relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. We stress the need to refrain from conflating the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people with the terror tactics of Hamas. It is only through a fulfillment of the Palestinian people's inalienable rights, including to self-determination, that we can effectively relaunch a credible peace process. Thank you.
I thank you. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of China. I would also like to, like others, thank Director General Ghebreyes and Director General Gilani for their briefings. The current round of Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been going on for 35 days now, and the situation continues to deteriorate. When tens of thousands of people, including more than 4,000 children, have lost their lives, when more than 1.6 million people have been forced to flee their homes, when 2.3 million people continue to be cut off from water, electricity, fuel, food, and medicine, and when hospitals, schools, refugee camps, and UN facilities have been frequently targeted, this is not only a humanitarian crisis, but it's more also a crisis of humanity, as described by Secretary General Guterres. This morning, in my capacity as President of the Council, I met with the representatives of Palestine and other Arab countries and those from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. From our conversation, I was deeply struck by the pain they have deep in their hearts. I was struck by their expectation for resumption of peace and by their expectation for the Council to take effective action. In the face of all this, the world must speak out together. Enough is enough. In the face of all this, the Security Council must do away with the obstruction and interference of some members and take immediate, responsible, and meaningful action to uphold justice and maintain peace. A ceasefire and a halt to the fighting must be put in place without delay. A ceasefire is by no means a diplomatic statement. It is the only hope for the people of Gaza to survive. We call on all parties, especially the major power that has the unique influence on the parties, to put aside all geopolitical considerations and double standards, focus all efforts on the goal of a ceasefire and an end to the fighting. We urge Israel to curb the intensifying settler violence in the West Bank and to avoid this concurring hotspot and the spread of conflict. The protection of civilians cannot be delayed. We condemn all violence and attacks against civilians. We express our grave concern at and strong opposition to the clear violations of international humanitarian law in Gaza. We urge an end to the collective punishment of civilians. We demand that the physical safety and humanitarian needs of detainees be guaranteed and call for diplomatic efforts to facilitate their early release. There is no time to lose in saving lives. More than 1,300 children and their families are trapped in the rubble. We support the Council in taking urgent action in this regard to facilitate a sustained truce of multiple days and an immediate opening of a green corridor for specialized agencies and equipment to enter Gaza to carry out search and rescue operations so as to do our utmost to save children. The Council should also respond to the joint appeal made by Director General Ghebreyes and and Commissioner General Lazzarini to promote the establishment of a medical evacuation mechanism so that pregnant women and those seriously injured and the sick in Gaza can be transferred and treated in a timely manner. The resumption of supply deliveries is urgent. We call on Israel to immediately lift the blockade and completely remove restrictions on livelihood supplies, especially fuel delivery to humanitarian and medical institutions and livelihood facilities. Over the past 2 weeks, just over 500 trucks have entered Gaza through the Rafah crossing, which is a drop in the bucket for the people of Gaza who are struggling on the brink of death. All crossings into Gaza should be utilized. And the Kerem Shalom crossing should be opened as soon as possible. Colleagues, these days, we also hear frequent discussions about the day after for Gaza. Regarding this point, it must be pointed out that no arrangement for Gaza can be imposed on the Palestinian people. No solution to the current situation can deviate from the two-state solution. The future of Palestine must be and can only be decided by the Palestinian people themselves. China is ready to continue to work with the international community to make our unremitting efforts to bring an early end to the fighting and alleviate the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, achieve peaceful coexistence between the Palestinians and Israelis, and realize long-term peace and security in the Middle East. I thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Council. Mr. Ghebreyes required to make a further statement. Now I give the floor to Mr. Ghebreyes.
Thank you, Mr. President. As I said earlier, in Gaza, nowhere and no one is safe. Imagine that you're trapped in that situation. Just imagination. So that's why we're asking for a ceasefire. We're asking for unfettered humanitarian access. And at the same time, of course, we're also asking for the UN Security Council to do everything for the release of the hostages. Then the second thing I would like to say is, because many of you have raised that issue, is the two-state solution. I visited Israel in 2014 when I was foreign minister. And if there was one thing that I underlined then, I said the Gaza situation is unsustainable. It's dangerous. And that Israel should make a solution. And that's the two-state solution. Of course, many say the two-state solution is good for Palestine. But I strongly believe that it's a very good and important solution for Israel too. And during that visit in 2014, what I said to my Israeli counterparts at the time is, please do it for your own sake. The two-state solution, a lasting solution. And I'm really glad, while addressing this acute condition, the UN Security Council is also underlining the long-term solution. So with that, thank you so much again for inviting me. I'm glad to be back to this room where I have been many times before. And the last thing which I said earlier, please take the UN Security Council reform central and real commitment, to be honest. Thank you so much, Mr. President, and back to you.
I thank Mr. Ghebreyes for his further statement. I also thank him for his presence and briefings today. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.